Morning, ladies and ladies. It's always good to be here. Missing a couple of people, man. I miss Linda's engagement.
She probably be here shortly.
Yeah. All right. Well, today, we starting a little bit late, about 15 minutes late. So we have about an hour and 15 minutes to go for this. This is a topic that is very sensitive, something that I definitely think is very relevant for us as clinicians, and social workers, practitioners. But the title is Juvenile Justice and Its Impact on the Black Youth. For me, you guys know about me that I'm a New Yorker, and as a New Yorker, you get experience. I've been able to experience some engagements or interactions rather with the New York City police department, and it was unwilling. I can recall back about early mid '90s. I was going to my girlfriend's house, and it was a snowstorm, and I was in the car, and I was in the cab in the back seat, and then the police lights came on. And they pulled the cab over, and I was like, did this guy run a red light or what, right? What is going on? But the police officer opened my door with his gun drawn at me and told me to get out and told me to put my hands up, and they just frisked me, and I just felt like totally violated. And then I asked him, I said, well, officer, I said, could you tell me why you pulling me over? Why you doing this? And he's like, well, somebody robbed the store, and you fit the description, and they jumped in the cab to get away. I said, well, can I ask you where this happened at? And he told me, and I was like, well, I caught a cab in a total different direction from this location. And then the cab driver confirmed where he picked me up at, and the officer was like, okay, you're free to go. And so, of course, I felt totally violated because, they done searched me in all types of areas and, my genitals, and just totally felt me up and just totally violated me. And at the time, I was about 10, 15 blocks away from where I was trying to go. So I just said, I'll walk to this destination to try to get my mind right, get my mind clear with what was going on. But, what I found was that that incident with me is nothing that is uncommon. When I put this training together, the research, the data just like spilled over, and it was like really ridiculous. And it's so much information that I'm even considering putting a book together, because if you can get research this easy and pull together training, for, this one is for an hour and a half, but I'm doing one for NASW for 6 hours, and I could do a training for all day, all week on all of this data, and it can be depressing, but I do want to just talk about the facts associated with it, some of the myths and some of the derivatives, some of the laws as well. I was listening to Amy Goodman this morning, and they were talking about my great city of New York and the stop and frisk program that they have, that stop and frisk law, rather when police officers, they stop and frisk, they have stopped and frisked over 5 million people within New York City. And 9 out of 10 of those individuals have been African American. That's really like staggering numbers. And with my video, with my training, Mitch, you'll be attending in a couple of months. You'll see the videos of stop and frisk as well. I got some videos, so it's really engaging. But it also has the response from the police officers and just how they deal with it as well, because from a police officer's perspective, they are being mandated to stop and frisk people, right? So they go into the communities because they said, well, the communities in these poverty communities, which are majority African American and Latino communities, they want our presence. So they go in there, and the form that they fill out is called 250s. So their superior officers are making them get X amount of 250s, right? Because if you get X amount of 250s, these forms with X amount of stop and frisk, then guess what? You get a promotion, right? So you get a promotion. So there's an incentive program, in place to stop and frisk and harass people. And most of these individuals are innocent. They don't have any drugs, any guns, anything on them. A lot of people say they get frisked coming out of their house. So they feel like they're a prisoner of their own, within their own neighborhood. And with all of this information that's being processed, they're putting all of this information into a database and collecting this. So they were talking on Amy Goodman this morning, like, is this information going to be tracked to see where all Black and brown people live? And if so, for what purpose? So, there's a lot of different variables that go on with this. But some of the things I do want to talk and get you guys to participate in is just saying, what do you think could be a solution for this? Like, what can we do? Because I don't want to put everything into the government's hands and to, these public officials' hands. I definitely think that, if each one of us in this room did something within our community, within our organization, we could potentially make an impact on the changes on these biased laws, because that's what it is. I mean, it's really unbiased. So all children, regardless of what race, what color, what gender, what sexual orientation, all deserve the right to be treated fairly. Okay, everybody needs to be treated fairly. They don't need to be violated. And there's a lot of stereotypes that go on, and there are a lot of myths associated with who is a criminal and what a criminal looks like. I mean, unless you were on Pluto or Mars, you know about the Trayvon Martin and George Zimmerman case, right? And we'll talk a little bit about that. I don't want to beat folks over the head, but it's something that we do need to continue having these conversations about, because although it's not on television anymore, on the news, we still need to have these conversations to talk about what we can do, from a grassroots perspective, to help these young folks within our community, particularly the African American males as well. So some of the objectives, again, we're going to talk about the myths associated with incarcerated minorities, the family component, racial ethnic diversity of youth impacted by the court system, and how to identify some appropriate community resources. So before I can even jump into this, I mean, it would behoove me to discuss the correlation between slavery, right, and prison, right? Because it is a huge connection there. Just like stop and frisk didn't just start in New York. I mean, it started back in the days of Jim Crow, back on the islands of Africa, on the shores of Africa as well. And really identifying the strongest individuals to have them to come to, it's a business, come to work, right? Come to work. So, it is huge, but again, that whole psychological raping of individuals to make them feel enslaved, to make that feeling be normalized. So I have a photo here, and this is like from Jim Crow, so it's very graphic, but it's really telling. But this is, many of you guys have seen this before, but this is what justice has looked like. If you guys want to pass that around, you can. But that's what justice looked like, in the early 1900s, late 1800s. That's what it looked like. And even into the 50s and the 60s. And it's really hard. And, really, if you were African American, you were looked at as public enemy number one. Right? Public enemy number one. So it's very disturbing. But the history of juvenile justice, in 1899, Cook County, which is in the state of Illinois, they were the first to really establish the first juvenile court. But within the next 30 years, that's when other states implemented a juvenile justice component. After there was a case, a Supreme Court case, it went to the Supreme Court in 1967. It was the kid's name was Galt, but he was incarcerated for a real minor crime, because when we were kids, we all did mischievous stuff, right? That's the time when you do it, is when you're a kid, right? Because you get spanking. Worst case scenario is like you wouldn't get dinner and got a spanking that night, right? So this kid did some real child like thing, which got him incarcerated. And they incarcerated him, but they didn't allow him the ability to call his mother. His mother was looking for him. She didn't know where he was. They detained him. They didn't let him call. They didn't let him have proper representation from an attorney. They didn't let him have any of those things. So when his mom found out where he was, because she found out from a neighbor who told her, she went to the prison. They got him out and they didn't charge him. So she took this to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court came up with with the law to say that any juveniles that are incarcerated should have right to due process, having an attorney, having a right to plead the Fifth Amendment, and having a right to call someone, but also having their parents involved. Because can you imagine how scary that is if you're a child, you get handcuffs thrown on you and placed into a prison cell, and not being able to hear the voice of a loved one, that's really traumatic and traumatizing. So some facts, these are some statistics and facts about African American youth and delinquency. The arrests among African American youth are normally between 10 and 17. It's nearly twice as the rate of their white peers. African American youth are 1.4 times more likely to be detained than their white peers among all racial groups. Whites are the least likely to be detained. Nationwide, 1 of every 3 young black males is in prison, on probation, or on parole. Although minorities make up 1/3 of the total U.S. population, they make up 2/3 of the young offenders behind bars. Nationwide, young black offenders are more than twice as likely to be transferred to adult facilities, and white youth are twice as likely to be defended by private attorneys, while African American youth have public defenders who normally aren't the best, right? Nearly 60% of young offenders serving time in adult state prisons are African American, although African Americans comprise over 15% of the youth population. So you see those numbers, and something is really, really staggering with that. So it's sort of as though you're not really looked at as a human being, right? You looked at as a prisoner, as an inmate, as a profit maker, as a slave, right? So, that was when, I shared with you guys before that, when I worked in shock trauma, and the images that I saw, shock trauma within itself is really kind of gruesome. Like, you gotta be like a horror fan to like want to be, I walk down the hall and see like brain fragments there, like, oh, okay, they didn't clean this up. You kind of normalize some of that medical trauma. But, again, as a social worker at the time, I was working with those guys who came in who were injured, but then I would go into their communities, and then if they got incarcerated, I would go into the to the prison system to meet with them. And, you got to deal with the correction officers who cannot be the most nicest people there, right? And then also, just seeing that, all of those different variables, also going into the court system, going into the courtrooms, sitting there waiting to testify on behalf of my clients, all I saw that came in was black males. Mm-hmm. So it became so overwhelming for me that I just chose to take myself out of that job and just say, all right, I'm done. Because the images for me to see, folks that look exactly like me, black males, it was distorting for me and my perception. And even as a black male, you can stereotype, your own people, right? If they come around on a regular basis and you see them in these demeaning type of situations, that you feel that, some way that they deserve this, that they did a crime, that they are guilty before proven innocent, right? So how a youth ends up in the adult justice system, which is pretty horrible within itself. But really, it all depends on the type of crime that they do. So if it's a murder, if it's an intentional murder, if it's a rape, if it's a robbery with a gun, like, they can go into the adult system because those types of actions were normally, for the most part, premeditated, right? And they can get placed into the adult system. However, once they're charged as an adult, they always will be an adult. There's no going back to being a juvenile once you're in that system. So you go into the prison system, 14, 15 years old. What do you think is going to happen to a kid 14, 15 years old who goes into the prison system with a bunch of adults?
That normalization. Considering that they're going to learn bigger and better. Mm-hmm.
They're gonna become better criminals when they come out, because they're gonna have all the school. They're gonna have a PhD and being criminals, right? What else you think could happen to them?
Victimized.
Yeah.
Taken advantage of. Absolutely, they can be raped, beat, so forth, so on. And there's another case that I'm not going to go into it in detail in here, but there's a movie on it, the Central Park Five. Anybody saw that documentary on the Central Park Five? It was about it's 4 African American boys and 1 Latino boy, and they were, again, being teenagers. They were between the ages of 13 14 to 17, and they went to Central Park. They lived in Manhattan, and
I think I read about that.
yeah, they were just kind of playing around, being mischievous, breaking car windows with rocks and woo, scaring people. And they ran into a whole bunch of other kids, and it was a whole big group of these youth that were pretty much being youth from the hood. And these five, they left. And they went home, and then the next day, the police came to their houses respectively, and pulled them to take them down to the police department. Basically, they were charged with raping a jogger. This was the Central Park jogger case. These guys spent all of their childhood incarcerated, and come to find out, they didn't do the crime. And one of the guys who was incarcerated, he was incarcerated in the same institution as the guy who committed the crime. Now, this young guy, the teenager who didn't do the crime, he was getting physically assaulted, sexually assaulted in prison, and the guy who actually raped the woman sees this stuff, somewhere gets a heart and confesses, and that's how they got exonerated for it. So they made a whole movie chronicling the events. So when you talk about adolescence and brain development, adolescence, your brain doesn't fully develop until you're around 25, because that whole frontal lobe, all of these neurons, all of this stuff is all connected. It's all being crafted and built. So it's not fully developed. So at least, especially with the kids that we work with here at Parker, that's why we can see some of the behaviors that they're doing, because their brains aren't fully developed. So as adults and as clinicians, we always are smarter than these children, because just by nature, because our brains are fully developed. We went to college, we have life experiences, so they can learn from our experiences. When they do things that are negative or they try to manipulate situations, we have the ability to take the upper hand, right? To have the upper hand, right? We normally, in most instances, we don't allow the children to bait us into their youthful manipulation, if you will, right? You're not going to try to go toe to toe and try to box out one of your clients. You have the skills to de-escalate, some of these children, right? So those are important skills to have. But, some of those adults in that adult prison system, again, they look at this child as prey, maybe even as a girl, right? Like, they don't even look at a little boy as being a boy. They look at him as being a little girl, because that's the normalization and the mindset of that institutionalized mind. All right, so race and ethnicity patterns of juvenile arrests. So homicide, non-lethal violence, drug abuse violations, and weapons violations, respectively, okay? Homicide, Black youth are the highest overrepresentation. Latinos are overrepresented in some cities. Non-lethal violence, like non-life-threatening instances, Black youth are overrepresented. Drug abuse violations, Blacks are overrepresented with that. And we know about the Rockefeller laws with the cocaine versus the crack cocaine, right? And they just put President Obama just signed an act to try to equal it out, because it was like 1 to 18. Now it's like 1 to 3. So it's really not fair. Still not all the way fair, but they made some progress, okay? So weapons violations, Blacks are overrepresented with that in terms of being arrested as juveniles with that. So who's a looter? So again, going into racial stereotypes, these are two photos from what we saw from the Hurricane Katrina incident a couple of years ago. So you have on your left, you have a Caucasian couple who were trying to get food, because that was just dire needs right there. It was like survival of the fittest right there. It's like, if you don't eat, you don't live. So, folks were like, no one's coming to save us. So they went and broke windows to get it. And on the right, you had this young guy who was doing the same thing as the folks on the left. They were looked at as trying to survive. He was looked at as a looter, right? So it's the perception in our mind and what a criminal looks like. The next one, this is an illustration I found on the net. I thought that was cool to share. But what if, right? And we talk about this, what if Trayvon Martin was Caucasian? And what if, George Zimmerman was African American? Do you think that we would have the same results?
No, absolutely not.
What do you think would have happened to the Black George Zimmerman?
I'm in jail.
They wouldn't even need a jury.
That would have been George Zimmerman, right?
Mm.
But it's all on the perception, right? And it all starts when you are a child and what sort of images were placed in your head in terms of, what a criminal looks like, who to stay away from, who can you play with, who's bad, who's good. And it's all into our linguistics as well. Because when you say black, right? You say black, what do you think when you hear black? What are some of the images you hear when you hear black? The word black.
The first thing that
color
comes
black.
to my mind is drugs.
Right.
It's the first thing that comes to my mind. I know that's ugly, but I think with all the media influence and that kind of thing, I think I have been somewhat brainwashed to kind of think that way.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
And it takes a lot to try and change that way of thinking.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. It's a lot. And I mean, even within the black community, within ourselves, I mean, we have a caste system instilled about who, light-skinned folks and what beauty looks like and what ugliness looks like. And we sort of segregate ourselves. We are racist against ourselves, and we help project those images and we support those stereotypes within our own community. When we hear the word white, what do we think about?
Clean.
You think about clean, you think like purity, you think about, virgin, like wedding, all white, all of these pure type things. You think about heaven, right? So it's all of these images that are like embedded within our brain to make us think about the different races, the different cultures. I mean, I know you guys are familiar with that research about they had with they did it with the black children with the brown eyes versus the blue eyes. And they had the brown-eyed kids and the blue-eyed kids. They separated them, and they said all of the blue-eyed kids were smart and the brown-eyed kids were not smart, and they believed it, and they started acting like it. And, there's all of these studies throughout history that kind of displays that as well to show you, like, how, because I was looking at something else on television, because I look at all these things when I'm trying to prepare these trainings. Mm-hmm. But it had a little young girl, and it had 4 pictures of like 4 drawings of little girls. Like it was like little caricatures of little girls. So one was like, crispy black, one was like, mocha black, and one was like light skin black, and one was white. And then they asked her, they said, well, who is the smart one? She was like, the white one. She said, who is the ugly one? She said, the black one. Mm-hmm. So, there was a real differentiation between these two. The two in the middle, she really didn't focus on as much, but it was really black and white. This was just negative, but she, obviously as a child, her brain is still not being developed, but as it is developing, she is incorporating this stereotype of self-hatred for herself and what beauty looks like, right?
And unfortunately, I think we teach our children that. I can remember when my youngest was like 4 or 5, and her best friend was a little white girl, and they had to do I don't know why they do this in preschool, but they had to do the self-image. Mm. And my daughter drew herself as a white girl, and the white girl drew herself as a brown kid because they saw themselves in each other, and was not really aware that, like my kid saw herself as a white girl, and the white girl saw herself as a brown kid because she's not looking at herself, she's looking at what her best friend looked like. And so somewhere along the line, we as a society screw that up.
Right, absolutely. I mean, what do they say? Everything that I learned in kindergarten, but then after that, you get older and then you go into this world and you learn all of these negative behaviors, these negative stereotypes, and just judging individuals and segregating from other individuals. And then in high school, you got the cool folks sitting at the table, the basketball team, the cheerleaders, and then you start isolating yourself from folks who are not, quote unquote cool. So, and it has to come to some level. We have to stop that. We have to stop that. And I think that it all begins with yourself, right? So if you don't know yourself, then you will not be able to progress, right? So when I was an undergrad, my major was Black Studies. All my Black friends was like, Mike, why are you studying Black Studies, man? You just want to get an easy A, man. Like you don't want to, you don't want to challenge yourself. But I was like, I want to have knowledge of myself, and I want to know my culture, because before then, I never was able to learn about my culture. I wasn't able to learn about the great things. All I knew was about slavery, Martin Luther King, Black Panthers, everything that the major society was going to give me. But I didn't learn about the things about Shaka Zulu, about Nat Turner, about the revolutionary folks there that were doing some great things. So that's folks that I pull from. Because if I never read Marcus Garvey's autobiography, I never would want to work for myself, right?
And I'm just saying, a lot of it just starts at home with what you speak in your house. I mean, in my house, we are very Black focused, I would say. Like, some people don't understand, but my daughter people aren't allowed to buy my daughter white dolls or T-shirts with white people on them or anything like that. And it's not because we're racist or hate Black people, but we want to promote self-love.
Right.
We want to teach her that you are beautiful and this is what beautiful look like, and just a whole self-love. So we support Black businesses, and we teach her that this is why we shop here, and this is why we go in. Not that we don't go, to other businesses as well, but just the importance of the Black community and just loving yourself. We have Black art in our house, and just different things like that. So if you ask my daughter on a game or something where they say choose your person or something like that, she's choosing the Black girl. Right. Because that's what we've taught her, that you are just as smart and just as beautiful as any other race. And it's not that we ever talk down on any other race in our house or, anything like that. We just promote self-love. So I think it starts at home, and what you're saying at home and what you're teaching at home as well. Because like you said, if you don't know yourself and if you feel inferior, that translates over into your children, because they can see that and feel that, so.
Yeah, absolutely.
I just think that's important.
Most definitely, and I think also just the consistency, like constantly doing that. Right. Like I started doing Kwanzaa with my child when she was like 3 years old. So, the last Kwanzaa season, she's like, Dad, when are we going to do Kwanzaa? Right? So she got set up, like she has that. So I want to teach her those types of ideals, and so that she can instill that into her children and have those traditions with her children as well. So some disproportionate minority factors. I'm
going to ask a question. I'm trying not to digress, but how much is too much? Because I think, like, sometimes that line with my children, like my older two this year decided that they don't celebrate Independence Day. And I asked them, I was like, why don't you celebrate Independence Day? And they said, because we were still slaves. We were not free. The country was free, but we were not. And I thought, oh my God, now my poor children don't want to celebrate anything. Right. What have I done to them? Like, they don't even want to go watch fireworks because they're like. So I'm struggling with what is too much. Where's that line to be open and to be, because I used to be the same way. Like, my kids could not have white dolls when they were younger. Now after you have the third kid, anything goes green. But yeah, I was always that way. And then when they talked about when they have to do those stupid things about family history, and I would always write the teacher a note and say, this is a great whatever, but it is extremely difficult for us to go through this because our history was stolen from us, blah, blah, blah. I go through the whole thing, and my children have started to kind of incorporate that. But I don't want them to be angry. I don't want them to, I want them to be proud and to love themselves and love, not be ashamed to be Black. But I also don't want them to be angry. Do you know what I mean?
Absolutely.
Hate white people.
Right, absolutely. Well, a couple of things you said are definitely irrelevant. About them not wanting to celebrate Independence Day, and because that we were slaves at that time, our ancestors were slaves, which is totally true. But that's showing you that they know about their ancestry as well, right? Because they know where we were. And I think that we need to take we need to take some good examples from our Jewish brothers and sisters, right? Because they say what? What's their phrase? Never forget, right? They never forget their history, and they don't speak hate about Nazis and so forth, but they never forget as a culture what they went through as a culture, and that is so true, and they live by that, and so there's a lot to learn from them and how they handled their victimization as a culture. Because anytime I do trainings. I did a training on psychological first aid, and I was talking about trauma in the inner cities, and a woman was there, and it was like 45 participants there, and she says, "Hey, what about the Jews?" Right? And she really wanted to share their experience, so she was not far removed from that whole Holocaust component, because we were talking about, it was a tertiary approach. I mean, we're talking about psychological first aid. That within itself could be a whole training, but then I took it to the next level to talk about this violence and the pervasiveness within the inner city, and then she took it to the next level to say, hey, what about the Jews? So always remembering where they come from, and that being inculcated within you and the fabric of who you are. But it's not teaching hate, and it's interesting because I was talking with a student yesterday. Because I teach at Baltimore City Community College. He's a graduate, and he came back because his mom works there, and he went to Towson. And he was telling me, he's graduated in May, and he was telling me that he was the president of the Blac Student Union. And I said, well, I saw a lot of stuff on the news about the guy who was the president of the White Student Union. And I was like, man, I was upset that the president didn't say anything. So we started talking about it, and he says, well, I think the guy's name was Matthew, the president of the White Student Union, and he says when he talked to Matthew, he says, well, I'm loving my culture, right? So for him, and I said, well, that's a good point. Like, I know that the president of the White Student Union was really probably authentic, right? Because certain kids, this generation that came behind us, like a lot of parents aren't telling them about slavery, about the civil rights era, so they don't know anything about that at all. So they see someone else loving their culture. They feel like, why can't I love my culture? Like, am I a racist for loving my culture? So you can flip that, from a white perspective to see, if they say that they love their culture as well. But as we know, it is different, right? Because if you say, hey, I love my culture and you're white, it's kind of viewed as being a white supremacist, right? It's like, it's not. So it's different. But disproportionate minority factors, again, these are things that disproportionately affect minorities, okay? Poverty, inadequate health care, lower quality schools, unsafe neighborhoods, households with less adult supervision, exposure to drugs, gangs, weapons, codes of the street, right? Media depictions of crime, neighborhood perceptions of offenders, police patrol, different environmental factors like do you fight or do you flight, right? So that Darwinism, that kill or be killed type of situation. So when you're like really low to the ground like this and your community is disproportionately affected by all of these different variables there, then that's when you want someone to really know and love themselves and to really believe in themselves, and where it's not looked at as a black supremacy thing, but really focusing on just some self-love and just trying to better yourself. Because if not, and as we know that you have learned helplessness and learned hopelessness, that people they can't even envision, they can't even dream of seeing themselves being a professional person. They can't even imagine themselves being an attorney, being a social worker, being a lawyer, being a physician. They can't imagine themselves doing those types of things, and that's their world. They can't even imagine themselves being 21 years old. They get to 21, it's like, man, like, where's the surprise? Like, where's the confetti popping out the air? Like, they can't believe that they have made it to that level, and that's so abnormal right there. That's really abnormal that's the way that they think. So you look at all of those different variables in terms of you're dark skinned and you're not good enough, and you live in a poor neighborhood, and you only have one parent, and that parent is working. It's really, the appetite for self-destruction. So when you go out on the streets, and you see someone who looks like you, you're going to hurt that person because they look like you as well. So in terms of the incarceration for juveniles, how does it impact families? couple things. Inadequate information about visiting procedures, right? Difficulty scheduling visits, right? So if you're a single parent and you have other children and one of your children gets incarcerated, childcare may become an issue to go and advocate for this other child that is incarcerated. Geographic locations of the prison. If your child gets incarcerated, they don't put them up the street, right? They can put them in a whole nother state. So then you have to find out transportation accommodations to go there to see your child. Visiting procedures that are super uncomfortable. If you've ever been to the Baltimore City Detention Center or any other detention center in the country, it is very uncomfortable, even if you go through there as a professional. You go show your badge, they still going to disrespect you, still going to treat you like you are an inmate when you're just going to visit one of your clients. I could not stand it. When you get in there, it's like paint chippings falling off the wall, and the correction officers sitting in the booth and looking at the prices right and just blasting it, and it's just people are yelling and babies are crying and it's hot and it's just like hell, right? And it's a horrible place to be. Okay, foster parents or caregivers who are unwilling to visit. To facilitate a visit. They don't want to have a visit with the child, right? Other impacts on the family. Many parents experience the following feelings if their child gets incarcerated. They feel guilt. They feel isolated. They feel alone, anxious, depressed. Some of them go to us abusing substances, because if your child gets incarcerated, you feel that you have failed. You get poor coping skills. Never forget, I was doing jury duty. I'm sitting in that jury room waiting hoping they don't call my number to go across the street, right? And I see this, how they have the guys coming out and they're like a little chain gang and they got the shackles on and they're coming and you hear the ching, ching, ching. And then I look out the door and I see a young mother. She's like a teenage mother and she has her son who's like 2 years old, and they're walking aside the chain gang and they're talking to the baby daddy's right there, and she's like having a conversation with them, and he's telling her what to do, and the child is like, "Hey, daddy, how you doing?" But this image is in his head, so he is normalizing these types of abnormal behaviors because he thinks that that's a place that he's supposed to be, right? If you're going there on a regular basis, that's a part of your childhood, right? I mean, even for us as adults, you go to some place like I was in, Dutch Wonderland. I remember my mom used to take me there when I was a kid, and there's certain smells are like, oh, I remember when I was 9 years old here, so you get certain smells and having that same type of physiological reactions to some things that are abnormal, it normalizes them, okay? So the unconscious racial stereotypes about African American offenders, these are just different quotes from individuals that are negative regarding African American offenders. And the guy says, indeed, if someone says that they were mugged or robbed, their house was robbed, most white people instantly picture an African American person, right? Police officers and judges, they also share that same sort of stereotypical behaviors and statements as well. I was looking at Trading Places with Eddie Murphy the other day, which was hilarious, right?
That's one of my
favorite 48 Hours is that's my second one. And then Beverly Hills Cop. But I digress. But then when they pulled them down and, when Mortimer and Randolph were talking and they said, do you think he came from a really bad neighborhood and so forth? He said, of course he did. He's a Negro. Probably been stealing since he could crawl. It was like, wow, that was so impactful that he said that. But they believed that. At least with the show. But, some people believe that you were born in this world wanting to rob, hurt, kill, and steal. Okay, so it's a three-part argument. Stereotypes about African Americans remain largely negative, right? They're on welfare, so forth. You can go for days, be crazy. You got a psychotropic. You're not taking your medication. You're on drugs. You don't want to work. You want to have sex all the time. You know what I'm saying? You can dance.
Had a lot of babies.
Because all the babies.
Yeah, the African Americans are oversexed. Like we can't control our.
Okay. I never heard that. But I guess it makes sense when the show said, well, because no other babies.
One of the things that I had with me, in my professional career, because I never was incarcerated, but it was like being a male and being like the only African American male within federal government, corporate America, hospital institute. I was always looked at like I wasn't authentic. Like I was always trying to get over on something. Like I was slick. Right? Like I was always trying to manipulate, like I wasn't being authentic. Like like I like photocopied my degrees or something, right?
Oh, wow.
Did you find yourself trying to prove that, like, that you are authentically Black?
I didn't because I studied African American studies. So I think if I didn't do that, if I would have studied another major in undergrad, it wouldn't have prepared me for what I experienced as a professional. So I was good with it. I mean, it would hurt, like especially if I had relationships with people and I thought that we were cool, but then a situation came up that showed me that you weren't really supporting me with it, and it was like clearly racial, although neither one of us would say it, that it was like we were friends, but still you had me in a stereotype. So that was always kind of, it hurt my feelings, right? I felt hurt. I mean, just like anybody else would feel. And sometimes you don't even feel like you're a human being. It's like, dude, I'm human, man. Like, I like, drink wine and, I like the things that you like, cheese, like, breathing, all of these things I like to do just like you. So that's like, wow, how can you think like that? But, so judicial facts, so different states, they benefit from incarceration, right? So you look at like New York, the 45th Central Senatorial District, rather, they have 13 state prisons that have over 14,000 prisoners, right? So the prisoners count as, they count the inmate population, and they use that count, they count them as residents for votes to get seats. Right, to get Republican seats and so forth. So it's all contingent on how many residents you have. So they use these prisons for that benefit. The prison industrial complex, which is the CCA, right, Corrections Corporation of America. Huge moneymaker, right? These are developers that they go into little cities that are struggling, like Baltimore, like Detroit, and then they say, hey, we can build you a prison, and this can make money for the state. But the only contingency plan, what do they say? The big print give it, and the small print take it away. In the small print, they said, yeah, we can build these prisons, you can get money, but one of the requirements is that you have to have a minimum of 90% occupancy rate. So you have to have these prisons full to at least 90%, and then you'll get your money, right? So what does that mean? That means that you need to lock up as many people as you possibly can so that we can get this money and people can get paid. So, and that's huge. And, we know about the African American communities, these low impoverished communities. I mean, we could drive down Middle Street right now. See people who are out on the streets. And why are they out on the streets? Because they're not working, because there's no jobs for them, because they don't have any education, because they dropped out of school, because there was no way for them to connect with the education system. So it's all connected with each other. So the prison industrial complex, right? Prison industrial complex is absolutely huge, right? So if we didn't have prisons, our economy would be totally shocked, right? It would be totally hit because there's so many different things that are made in prison. And if you didn't know, I'll tell you what things are made in prison, okay? So you have some different agricultural products, so coffee beans, so different cultivating of different fruits and vegetables on farms. They guys get a little pass to go out and get some fresh air. But you're going to work on this farm for me. We're going to pay you 8 cents an hour, right? Furniture, so many wood products. Paper industry, copy paper, notebook paper, pens, those black and white composition books we use, that's made in prison. Those blue books that we used when we were in grad school to write those essays, those were made in prison. Clothing, jeans, baseball caps for the Major League Baseball teams are made in prison. Canoes, books for the blind, lingerie, park benches and picnic tables. Get this, military jackets and battle garb. The human silhouette targets that you shoot for doing target practice, those are made by prisoners. And the old IKEA products were made by prisoners, right? So, you don't have to outsource these jobs. You can just send folks to prison and have these prisoners make this stuff for you for dirt cheap. It's another form of slavery. It's such a correlation. So this cradle to prison pipeline is something that they've been talking about. That's been getting some notoriety. It's huge. I mean, it's disgusting. But this guy is disgusting. This judge right here, Mark Civarella, Jr. I mean, he just was sentenced to 28 years. He was a judge in the state of Pennsylvania, but 28 years for literally exchanging youth to these prison systems for cash. So they were paying him between 5 to 10,000 per child that he would feed to the prison system. So a lot of these children who were being sentenced were, doing again regular juvenile types of activities that you get punished, and it would be a teachable moment so that you can live another day. Okay.
Somebody spilled the beans on him. Like, how did this come out?
I'm not sure if they spilled the beans. I'm not sure how they was able to find this information.
To do some research.
Yeah, I can definitely pull up some stuff on this as well.
Wow.
I'll tell you at the next training.
Oh.
So, one student was given 3 months in the detention center for mocking an assistant principal on his MySpace page.
Wow.
Right, so that's really ridiculous. So again, the school to prison pipeline, African American boys account for overwhelming number of school enforced punishments. Right, so corporal punishment, suspension, things of that nature. They get harsher punishments versus their white counterparts within the school system. But if you are incarcerated as a juvenile, you're going to miss out on so many different things, like an education, right, on future employment, with the ability to participate in a democracy. You're not going to be able to vote, at all. Also having here just a vigilante justice. This is another thing. Everything kind of always goes back to New York, right? In 1984, you had Bernard Getz, who he was approached by 4 youth on a New York City transit train, and they asked him for $5. He pulled out a gun and shot all 4 of them, and he paralyzed one of them, and he was acquitted. He was never incarcerated. They said, hey, he was protecting himself. He was on the train. They stepped to him. He pulled out a gun. If somebody pulls out a gun on me, I'm not trying to act, I'm going like this. I don't care if I'm with 3 or 4 people, but he got away with it, and this other youth was, so this whole George Zimmerman is the uproar. I mean, this stuff has been going on for years.
Right, I don't know if you remember the Oscar Grant in California. They just did movie Fruitvale. It's about.
Right.
I was living in California when that happened, and he was unarmed and handcuffed when they shot him.
I mean, there's so many different stories. Abner Louima in New York again, where they put a plunger and wrecked him and beat him, and it was ridiculous. I mean, Larry Davis, when they had him, the police strategically gave him drugs and said, "You go and you sell this in the African American community, like by force." And then when he says, "Look, I don't want to do this anymore," that's when they came after him, and that's when he got involved in the shootout with the police. And then he finally, after two days of going back and forth and hiding and so forth, he surrendered and they incarcerated him. And when he was incarcerated, the police, the correction officers, they beat him to the point where he couldn't walk. He was paralyzed. And they didn't give him a wheelchair, any accommodations. He was basically like crawling around on the floor like a snake, right? And then ultimately, they continuously beat him over the years, and he died. Right, so no one even knows that Larry Davis is dead. But he was killed behind prison bars. Right, so it's just really been difficult rather. So again, youth of color are disproportionately impacted by state transfer laws. This one is on the little table here in terms of juvenile system versus the adult system. So parent involvement. If you're in the juvenile system, parents and guardians must be involved. Youth released from detention center, only the parents or guardians. Youth have no right to pretrial and no right to bond. If they're in an adult system, parent and guardians need not be notified. You don't need to be notified if your child is incarcerated. Youth can make bail and leave county jail on their own recognizance. Well, that should say adult, right? Adult can make the bail and leave on their own recognizance, right? With education, youth must attend school or get a GED if they're in a juvenile system. If they're in an adult system, no education is required. Age-appropriate services, treatment, and punishment. Youth receive assessments, counseling, trainings, tutoring, parenting skills, substance abuse, evidence-based therapies. They're in adult system, services not required or often never even offered. Those offered are intended for adults and therefore are not developmentally appropriate for youth. So you see, if you have a child who is placed in an adult system, the parents can't have any involvement with them. They can't make bail on their own. They can't leave on their own recognizance. They don't get any requirements for education. They don't get any mental health services. So you're there, you're being victimized multiple times as a youth. So some of the solutions, obviously, changes in laws is required. I mean, the stop and frisk, that has to be done with. The stand your ground, that stuff has to be stopped. Definitely instilling comprehensive first-time youth offender programs that involves the parents, which involves social workers, which involves community partners. I mean, I worked at Progressive Life Center about 15 years ago, and that was for first-time youth offenders, and it was a comprehensive program. Because it did involve everybody that I just mentioned. It was 90 days, and the parents, we had the parents were involved, and the parents would come and say, why do I got to be involved? He's the one who did the crime. It's like, no, we're going to do this from a holistic perspective, because if you are his parent or her parent, you're involved as well, and we want you to continue to be involved. And we would take them out to West Virginia for a retreat for the weekend and really have some strategic activities for them to participate in, so that they could see, so they can learn about communication skills with their child and learn about the things that they needed to help them to deal with, law enforcement. Like we talk about having the talk, right? Having the talk with your child and what they need to do in terms of, if the police pull them over or stop them as well. Giving them the counseling and the support while they're institutionalized, while they're in the prison, right? Having a mentoring program for ex-juvenile offenders, and again, just having that community support. So Kim's she's looking at the scenario already, but I got, there's two like case studies.